Imagine yourself inside the echoing halls of the Lateran Palace in Rome. The marble floors chill your bare feet as the incense of morning mass still lingers in the air. The world outside is trembling. Kings at war, nobles scheming, peasants starving. Yet within these sacred walls, another drama unfolds. Here, power is not only spiritual, it is carnal, corrupt, and unspeakable. And at the center of it all, a child, caught in the silken nets of desire, ambition, and betrayal. Welcome, friends, to Whispers of History. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Is it early morning, the soft hum of life around you? Or is it late, with the room in darkness and only my voice carrying you into the past? Let us know below. And if you find yourself drawn into the shadows of history, don't forget to subscribe to join us again. Tonight's story is not of saints, but of sinners. It is about the forbidden love that flourished under the very shadow of the papal throne. The tale of a child drawn into the orbit of the Pope, first as a servant, then as a companion, and finally as something much darker. It is a story of seduction disguised as holiness, of innocence devoured by the world's most powerful man, and of how the Church's greatest sanctuary became a place of whispered scandal. This is not legend. This is history, whispered in letters, chronicled in diaries, preserved in the accusations of enemies. The story we unravel tonight takes us into the 10th and 11th centuries, the so-called Pornocracy of Rome, when popes and cardinals were less shepherds of souls and more princes of pleasure. Our focus lies on Pope John XII, a man who ascended to the papal throne at just 18. His reign, from 955 to 964, is remembered as one of the most scandalous in church history. But long before his scandals filled Rome with whispers, they began with a boy, a child brought into his court as part of his household. The sources do not name him, they never would. But fragments remain, enough to reconstruct the story of a relationship both shocking and dangerous. Picture the Lateran Palace, torchlight flickering against frescoed walls, corridors echoing with footsteps of priests and servants. Among them, the boy perhaps, no more than 12, attending to the Pope's chambers, pouring wine, fetching water, carrying letters. His youth made him both invisible and desirable. To John XII, already notorious for his appetites, he was more than a servant. He was a secret waiting to be claimed. Chroniclers like Lateran of Cremona, writing with open hostility toward John XII, accused the Pope of turning the papal palace into a brothel, filling it with lovers both male and female. Lateran's words are sharp, meant to condemn, but behind the venom lies a kernel of truth. John XII's relationships were not confined to noble women. They extended to those most vulnerable: children, servants, the powerless who could not refuse. The boy was drawn deeper into his orbit. At first, he may have thought it an honor, the Pope's hand resting on his shoulder, his words gentle, his gifts generous. But honor curdled into captivity. Soon, he was no longer serving wine in public halls, but lingering in private chambers. No longer a child of the city, but a possession of Rome's most powerful man. The secrecy was suffocating. To the outside world, the Pope was God's chosen. To the boy, he was something else entirely. And yet, the boy's silence was his only survival. For in Rome, during the reign of John XII, whispers could kill. The scandal of the Pope's desires did not remain hidden forever. Rumors spread through Rome, of mistresses and lovers, of sacred halls defiled by lust. The boy's presence became another thread in the tapestry of corruption. Some spoke of him openly, others only in murmurs. But all knew that beneath the gilded altars, innocence was being consumed. What makes this story so haunting is not only its brutality, but its intimacy. This was not the brutality of swords or flames, but of stolen childhood, of power wielded in the most private spaces. The boy was not chained in markets or paraded in streets. His chains were invisible, woven of fear, dependence, and the twisted affection of the most powerful man in Christendom. And so, beneath the soaring arches of the Lateran, history's most sacred office became the setting of its darkest secret. But how did this child's story unfold? How did whispers of his presence echo into chronicles of papal corruption? And how, in the end, did Rome respond to a pope whose bed was more scandalous than his throne? The Lateran Palace was meant to be the heart of Christendom, but under Pope John XII it became a theatre of contradiction. Outside, pilgrims knelt before him as the vicar of Christ. Inside, feasts turned into orgies, and the boy, once a nameless servant, became a constant presence at the Pope's side. At first he was hidden in plain sight. He carried letters, poured wine at banquets, attended to the Pope's robes and ornaments. None thought much of it. The papal household was filled with boys his age, attendants drawn from families eager to place their sons close to power. But John's gaze lingered too long. His hand brushed the boy's shoulder too often. And when the feasts ended, the child vanished into the Pope's chambers, not returning until dawn. Rome noticed. Rome always noticed. This was the eternal city where every gesture was watched, every whisper magnified. Courtiers smirked, priests whispered, servants traded stories in the shadows. The Lateran's marble halls, once echoing with hymns, now reverberated with scandal. The Chronicles are merciless in their judgment of John XII, Liutprand of Cremona. In his Antipodosis, accused the Pope of every vice imaginable: gambling, blasphemy, even toasting to the devil. He wrote that John turned the sacred palace into a brothel. The phrase is striking not because it is exaggerated, though it surely is, but because it reflects the atmosphere surrounding him. The Lateran was not only corrupt, it was infamous. And within that infamy, the boy was swept up like driftwood in a storm. He was no longer just a servant, he was a symbol. His youth, his silence, his constant presence in the Pope's chambers, all of it became ammunition for John's enemies. But what did the boy himself feel? History leaves us no words of his own, but the outlines are easy to imagine. To be singled out by the most powerful man in the church could have felt like both honor and trap. The Pope showered him with gifts, fine clothes, trinkets of silver, perhaps even land promised in the future. To a child, it might have looked like fortune, but beneath the gold lay chains. Refusal was impossible. Escape unthinkable. The atmosphere of the Lateran made those chains even heavier. The boy was not the only figure caught in John's appetites. There were noblewomen, courtesans, widows, and wives. Chroniclers claimed he seduced aristocratic women, violated pilgrims' daughters, even lay with his own close kin. Whether every accusation was true or embroidered by enemies hardly matters. What matters is that John's reputation was one of unchecked desire, and the boy was part of it. And so the child became more than a victim of private corruption. He became a living witness to the degradation of the papacy itself. For what greater scandal could there be than the Pope, Christ's representative on earth, not only indulging in lust, but drawing a child into his bed? The whispers grew. Servants in the palace dared to murmur his name, though never loudly. Priests muttered about the boy's constant presence. Noble families, sending their sons to serve in Rome, began to wonder whether proximity to the Pope was a blessing or a curse. In taverns, rumors spread like wildfire. John XII himself did nothing to quiet them. He was young, impulsive, arrogant. At 18, he had been raised not by discipline but by indulgence. The papal throne had not sobered him. It had emboldened him. If Rome whispered, let it whisper louder. He believed himself untouchable. But the truth was more dangerous than he knew. For in the mid-10th century, the papacy's authority was not secure. The Holy Roman Emperor Otto I watched Rome carefully, wary of its instability. Rivals among the Roman nobility, especially the Crescenti and the Tusculani, plotted constantly. Every scandal, every whisper of corruption was fuel for their ambitions. The boy's presence, became part of that fuel. Enemies of John XII did not need to invent scandal. They only needed to point. "Look at the Pope," they said. "Look at the palace of Christ. It is not a church, it is a brothel. He does not shepherd souls. He devours innocence." And so, the child was trapped in more than a private nightmare. He was trapped in a political storm, his very existence a piece of evidence in the trial of a pope's corruption. He had no voice in it, no choice, no escape. He was a pawn in the games of men far older, far more powerful, and far more ruthless. For now, he endured in silence. He followed the Pope through marble corridors, into candlelit chambers, across the streets of Rome in public procession. To the crowd, he was just another servant. To those who knew, he was a living secret, a dangerous truth. And as John XII's scandals deepened, the boy's fate became ever more entwined with his master's downfall. The Lateran Palace glittered in public, but behind its walls the rot spread. Pope John XII continued to live as though Rome were his playground, not his parish. His nights were filled with feasts, dice, and lovers. His days were consumed by hunting and gambling. Rarely did he celebrate Mass. More often, he raised his cup in drunken revelry. And always, the boy was there, silent, watchful. Caught in the orbit of power he could neither escape nor control. Chroniclers tell us that John XII invited women into the palace openly, bedding them within sight of courtiers and priests. Liutprand of Cremona claimed he drank toasts to pagan gods, invoking Venus and Bacchus in mockery of Christ. Whether these details were exaggerated by enemies matters little. What mattered was the impression they created. Rome's holy shepherd looked more like a decadent tyrant. The boy's role in these scenes remained unspoken yet undeniable. He poured wine during banquets, waited in the shadows while the Pope played dice, lingered near the bedchamber as courtesans came and went. At times, he disappeared with John into private rooms, reappearing pale and silent. For those who knew, no explanation was needed. The whispers had become certainty, but scandal within Rome was one thing. Scandal reaching the ears of the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I was another. Otto had already crowned John XII as Pope in 955, expecting him to be a loyal partner, a spiritual counterpart to imperial power. Instead, he heard rumors of debauchery, simony, even treason, that John had conspired with his enemies, invited Hungarians into Italy, and plotted against the empire itself. By 963, Otto had had enough. He marched into Rome with his army, determined to bring order. The boy, barely a teenager by now, would have watched the palace tremble as imperial banners appeared outside its gates. Soldiers filled the streets, their armor glinting in the sun. Rome's people, long weary of John's scandals, murmured approval. John fled rather than face Otto. He abandoned the Lateran, slipping away into the countryside. The boy likely went with him, carried like baggage, too entangled in the Pope's private life to be left behind. Imagine his terror, leaving the marble halls for dusty roads, sleeping in makeshift camps, hearing his master curse the emperor who dared to challenge him. Otto convened a synod in Rome. Bishops gathered, noblemen testified. The charges against John XII poured out like poison. He was accused of perjury, murder, sacrilege. He was accused of invoking demons, of hunting with hawks inside church courtyards, of wearing armor instead of vestments. And, hidden within these accusations, was the charge that carried the greatest shame, that he had defiled holy places with acts of lust, with men, women, and even children. The boy's name was never spoken. He was too young, too powerless, too erased. But his presence haunted the testimony like a ghost. Everyone in Rome knew of him. Everyone had seen the Pope's young companion trailing at his side. They did not need to say his name for the accusation to pierce. Otto and the bishops deposed John XII in his place. They elected Leo VIII, a man more pliant, more acceptable to the emperor's authority. But Rome is a city of chaos, and power never shifts cleanly. John, furious and desperate, rallied support. He returned to Rome with armed allies, storming the city, driving Leo into exile. The Lateran once again filled with his laughter, his dice, his lovers, and the boy, exhausted, bound to the man who owned him, was swept back into the chaos. The Pope's restoration was brief. In May 964, John XII suffered a sudden death. Chroniclers relish in their descriptions. Some say he was murdered by a jealous husband. Others claim he suffered a stroke while lying with a woman. Liutprand writes with relish that he was struck down by God himself, punishment for his sins. However it happened, the end was abrupt. At just 27 years old, John XII was gone, and with him, what became of the boy? History falls silent. No chronicle mentions him after the Pope's death. Perhaps he slipped into obscurity, dismissed by new masters, his existence too shameful to record. Perhaps he found himself back in the markets, another nameless servant. Or perhaps he was silenced, killed to bury the secret forever. His absence is the most haunting detail of all. For while John XII's name lives in infamy, the boy is forgotten, erased by time. Yet without him, the scandal loses its most intimate horror. He was the silent witness to the corruption of Christ's vicar, the human cost of power twisted into sin. The Lateran Palace endured. Pilgrims returned, popes followed, masses rang out once more. But beneath its stones, the shadow of that boy lingers still. The streets of Rome burned with tension in the spring of 964. The Holy Roman Emperor Otto I had deposed John XII and installed Leo VIII on the papal throne. For the first time in centuries, the emperor claimed the right to choose the pope himself. Rome seethed under this foreign dominance, and in the shadows, John XII plotted his return. The boy, still tethered to his master, must have felt the city tremble as whispers spread. The Lateran had fallen silent under Leo, its feasts replaced with sober liturgies. But in back alleys and noble houses, loyalists of John XII gathered arms. The Pope, who had once turned the palace into a scandalous brothel, now sought to reclaim it with blood. By April, he struck. With allies from the powerful Roman families, John stormed back into the city. Leo VIII fled in panic. The Lateran, once again, opened its doors to John's triumph. Torches blazed, voices roared, and the Pope, only 26 years old, returned to the throne as though nothing had happened. The boy walked at his side once more. Imagine his eyes as he watched Rome's nobles bow again to the man they had cursed. As he heard hymns sung for a pope everyone knew was steeped in scandal. To him, the contradictions must have been unbearable. The man who held him captive was once again hailed as Christ's vicar, his sins washed away by force of arms. But John's return did not bring reform. If anything, his appetites deepened. Chroniclers describe renewed debauchery in the palace, wine flowing, dice rolling, lovers entering by the dozen. The boy's silence stretched longer. Each night in the Pope's chamber was another reminder that escape was impossible. For if even the emperor's might could not end John's reign, how could one child resist? Yet fate had already begun to close in. On the 14th of May 964, the story ended in a way no one could have predicted. John XII was found dead in his chamber. The accounts differ, but each drips with scandal. One says he was struck down by a stroke while in the act of sin. Another whispers that he was murdered by the husband of a woman he had seduced. Liutprand of Cremona, ever the enemy, wrote gleefully that divine justice had struck the Pope Medembres, cutting short his life in punishment. Whatever the truth, John XII was gone at 27. His corpse was carried out in silence, buried in the Lateran without ceremony. Rome did not mourn him. The papacy passed to another. The palace moved on. But what of the boy? Here history falls completely silent. Not a chronicle, not a letter, not a single document preserves his fate. He vanishes the moment John XII's heart stopped beating. Perhaps he was dismissed, cast into the streets of Rome with nothing but bitter memories. Perhaps he was absorbed into another household, his past buried under layers of silence. Or perhaps, and this possibility chills us, he was silenced deliberately, his very existence too dangerous to leave alive. For the scandal of John XII was not only his drunkenness, his gambling, or his treason. It was the boy. His presence revealed not just corruption, but violation, a sin so dark that the church itself could not bear to acknowledge it. To erase him was to protect the papacy, to bury the shame. And so, the child disappears into history's shadows. No name, no face, no legacy, only silence. But the silence speaks. It tells us that beneath the gilded altars of Rome, beneath the hymns and incense, there was another story, one too brutal to write, one too dangerous to preserve. And in that silence, the boy lingers still. The papacy endured. New popes rose, emperors ruled, Rome continued. But the memory of John XII's sins haunted every successor. His reign became a warning, his name a curse. Chroniclers called him a monster, a man who turned the house of God into a den of lust. And though they never named the boy, their words carry his ghost. For what is history if not the record of power? And what is silence if not the testimony of the powerless? Tonight, we remember him, not as a name, but as a shadow in the corridors of the Lateran, a child caught in the web of the most powerful man in Christendom, a victim whose story, erased by scribes, still whispers across the centuries. And that is why we tell it now. The death of John XII in 964 should have ended the scandal. Rome buried him in haste, the marble floors scrubbed clean, the Lateran restored to solemnity, yet his shadow lingered. For the story of the boy was not only the story of one man's corruption, it was the symptom of an era, an age historians would later call the Pornocracy, when the papacy itself was stained by lust, ambition, and blood. To understand how a child could vanish into the arms of a pope, we must step back into the world that made it possible. Rome in the 10th century was not a city of saints, but a battleground of nobles. Families like the Crescenti and the Tusculani ruled the streets, trading power with swords and daggers. The Pope was not above them. He was their prize. Whoever controlled the papacy controlled Rome's wealth, its armies, its alliance with the emperor. And so, the papal palace became less a holy refuge than a prize of war. John XII himself had been installed through the maneuvering of his family, the Counts of Tusculum. He was barely a man when crowned, chosen not for his virtue but for his bloodline. From the beginning, his throne was less an altar than a weapon. In such a world, morality was not protection. The vows of priests, the innocence of children, the sanctity of marriage, all could be broken if power demanded it. The boy who entered the Lateran as a servant was swept into this current. To John XII, his body was not sacred. It was a token of dominance, as much a display of power as gold vessels or jeweled crosses. What makes the boy's fate so chilling is how ordinary it may have seemed within that corrupted court. Chroniclers tell of noble women visiting the palace openly, of clerics with mistresses, of bishops fathering children. John XII simply carried these vices to extremes. For him, indulgence was not hidden but flaunted, and the boy at his side, silent, powerless, became a living reminder that nothing was beyond his reach. Rome itself whispered with disgust. Pilgrims arriving at the Lateran came seeking holiness and found debauchery. Priests muttered that the Pope was less a shepherd than a wolf, but few dared speak aloud. To accuse John was to risk exile, imprisonment, even death. Silence protected the guilty, and in that silence the boy remained invisible. Yet the silence was not perfect. Liutprand of Cremona, writing for the emperor, catalogued John's sins with venom. He accused him of living like a pagan, of hunting, gambling, fornicating, even summoning demons. Among his charges was the corruption of the innocent, a phrase that could only mean boys like the one kept at his side. Liutprand's motives were political, but his words echo with truth. Even his exaggerations reveal what Rome already believed, that the papacy had sunk into filth. The boy's erasure after John's death was no accident. The church had too much to lose by preserving his memory. Better that he vanish than that the scandal fester. And so he slipped into the cracks of history, his name unrecorded, his fate unknown. All that remains are fragments, accusations, whispers, hostile chronicles, enough to chill us, but never enough to restore his voice. Yet his silence tells us something crucial. It reminds us that history is not only the record of kings and popes, but the erasure of the powerless. For every John XII whose sins fill pages, there are countless unnamed victims whose lives were consumed and forgotten. The boy was one of them, swallowed by the politics of Rome, silenced by the needs of the church, erased by the passage of time. Still, the Lateran cannot escape his ghost. To walk its halls today, beneath frescoes of saints and martyrs, is to feel the weight of that silence. Beneath the marble lies the memory of a child who once lived there, not as a servant of God, but as a prisoner of sin. And if his story feels distant, it is only because history has worked to bury it. For in truth, the boy's fate was not exceptional. He was one among many whose bodies became currency in an age when power corrupted all it touched. His tragedy is that he was caught not only in the desires of a pope, but in the corruption of an entire century. Rome moved on after John XII. New popes rose, some holy, others corrupt. The Crescenti and Tusculani fought on, spilling blood in alleys and basilicas alike. But the memory of John's sins lingered as a stain that no successor could fully wash away. And though the boy's name is gone, his presence lingers in every word of condemnation, every whisper of corruption, every chronicle that branded John XII as the most scandalous pope in history. The silence around him is not empty. It is filled with echoes, of footsteps on marble, of whispered laughter, of prayers left unanswered. It is filled with the truth history refused to write. And tonight, that silence becomes a story once more. John XII had been laid in the earth, his short and scandalous reign ended, yet his ghost refused to fade. Rome could not forget him. The papacy could not erase him. His name clung like a stain, a symbol of everything the church wanted to bury but could not. Chroniclers wrote of him with venom. Liutprand of Cremona, Otto I's ally, described John as a monster of wickedness, a man who turned the Lateran into a brothel and mocked God in his very chambers. The Libra Pontificalis, the papal chronicle, preserved his name but could not soften his memory. Even centuries later, reformers cited him as the nadir of papal corruption, proof of how far the church could fall when unchecked. In these accounts, the boy never appears. He is erased, silenced, buried deeper than John himself, and yet he is everywhere between the lines. When Liutprand wrote of the Pope's corruption of the innocent, who else could he have meant? When whispers spoke of children in the papal chambers, who else could have been at the center? His absence is itself a testimony, a reminder of how victims are effaced while their abusers are remembered. The 11th century brought reform, a movement that sought to cleanse the church of corruption. Popes like Gregory VII thundered against simony, clerical marriage, and lay control. But reform was also an act of forgetting. The sins of men like John XII were acknowledged only as cautionary tales, stripped of human detail. The boy's story remained locked in silence, because to admit it fully would have been to admit the depths of the papacy as shame. Yet the memory of John XII haunted these reforms. Every new scandal was measured against his. When popes took mistresses in later centuries, when whispers of corruption echoed again, scribes invoked his name. At least not as bad as John XII, they said. He had become the benchmark of disgrace. But what of the child who had once walked Rome's marble halls? He had no chronicler, no defender, no reformer to remember him. His survival, if he lived at all, was quiet. Perhaps he grew into a man and left Rome behind. Perhaps he took vows and entered a monastery, burying his past beneath prayer. Or perhaps he was swallowed by the same silence that consumed so many children in history, gone without record, remembered only as rumor. The silence is chilling because it was deliberate. The papacy needed to erase him. To record his existence would have been to confess the darkest crime of all, that the vicar of Christ had not only fallen to lust but preyed on a child. Better to let him vanish, to leave him nameless, to let his story rot with whispers. And yet, silence does not erase truth. The boy's presence lingers like a shadow in the Chronicles, in the accusations, in the venom poured against John XII. He is the figure behind the curtain, the unspoken evidence of corruption too terrible to write. His absence is the loudest testimony of all. As centuries passed, the papacy sought to rebuild its dignity. The Gregorian reform, the rise of papal monarchy under Innocent III, the grandeur of St. Peter's, all were meant to wash away the sins of the past. But beneath the marble and gold, the memory of John XII remained like a scar. Even today, historians recall him as one of the most corrupt popes. His gambling, his violence, his debauchery, all are written with relish. And though the boy is never named, modern scholars see the outlines clearly. They read Liutprand's charges, they trace the whispers, they understand the silences. The story the church would not tell has begun to emerge. The boy's erasure mirrors countless others. History is filled with victims whose voices were never written, whose stories were silenced to protect the powerful. He stands among them, anonymous yet symbolic, his suffering absorbed into the larger tragedy of an age when power devoured innocence. And so, in the long shadow of John XII, the child's ghost walks still. He is not in the Chronicles, but in the gaps between them. He is not in the monuments, but in the whispers behind them. He is not in the memory of the church, but in the silence that reveals what the church chose to forget. The Lateran Palace still stands today. Its marble halls gleam with centuries of history. Its frescoes tell stories of saints and popes. Pilgrims walk through its corridors, unaware of the shadows beneath. Yet somewhere in those stones, the boy's footsteps remain, faint, forgotten, but never erased. His silence is history's silence. His absence is history's guilt. And his story, though untold, is still alive in the whisper of corruption, in the echo of scandal, in the haunting memory of what power can consume. The story of John XII ends in scandal and sudden death, but the story of the boy never ends at all. That is what makes it so haunting. For while the Pope's name is preserved in chronicles and remembered in shame, the boy vanishes into silence. His life is not recorded, his fate not described. He disappears, as though history itself colluded with power to erase him. And yet, his presence is undeniable. He lingers in the words of Liutprand of Cremona, who accused John of corrupting the innocent. He lingers in the whispers of Rome, in the rumors that turned the Lateran into a byword for sin. He lingers in the venom of reformers who invoked John's reign as a warning but never dared name the child. Silence is not absence. Silence is testimony. The boy's erasure tells us not that his suffering did not happen, but that it was too dangerous to preserve. His existence threatened the papacy itself, for it revealed not just sin but sacrilege, that the vicar of Christ had preyed upon a child within the very heart of Christendom. Better, they thought, to bury him in silence. But history is stubborn. It leaves traces even when names are erased. And so we glimpse the boy not in chronicles, but in shadows. He is there in the gaps, in the evasions, in the venom that never quite dares to speak the whole truth. He is there in the way John XII's reputation was shaped, not just as a gambler, a drunkard, a fornicator, but as a pope whose sins defiled even the most innocent. Imagine him now, not as history left him, but as he truly was, a child. Perhaps no older than 12, walking marble corridors with a jug of wine in his hand, his eyes downcast, his heart pounding, his future stolen. He was caught in a web of power far larger than himself. A pawn in a city where noble families fought for thrones, emperors marched with armies, and popes wielded both crowns and sins. His suffering was intimate, but it was also political. His silence was not only his own, but Rome's. The Church's decision to erase him was itself an act of power, a way of protecting the institution at the cost of the individual. And in that erasure lies the greatest lesson of all. That power not only corrupts, but silences. John XII's death in 964 closed a chapter, but it did not end the story. The papacy stumbled on, scarred but unbroken. Reformers rose, emperors came and went, Rome endured. But the stain of his reign remained a warning, a memory that no marble or incense could wash away. And the boy, nameless, voiceless, became the embodiment of that stain. Even now, historians debate the details of John's life. Was Liutprand exaggerating? Were the rumors of demons and orgies slander? How much truth lies in the venom? But on one point, the evidence is clear. The papacy in the 10th century was a seat of corruption, and the innocent suffered most. Whether the boy was one or many, whether his name was lost or never recorded, his presence in the story is inescapable, and so his silence becomes his legacy. He speaks not through words, but through absence. He reminds us that history is written by those in power, and that the powerless are often erased. Yet erasure is not the same as forgetting. To tell his story now, even in fragments, is to break the silence that protected his abuser. The Lateran Palace still stands. Its walls gleam with frescoes of saints and martyrs. Its chapels echo with hymns of devotion. Pilgrims walk its corridors, their prayers rising to heaven. But beneath the marble, beneath the incense, beneath the centuries of sanctity, there is another layer. The memory of scandal, the echo of a child's footsteps, the whisper of a story buried but not destroyed. For history is not only what is written, it is also what is hidden. And the boy who became the Pope as secret lover is history as hidden truth, erased but not gone. Tonight, as you let this story settle in your mind, remember that the past is never simple. It is not only kings and popes, saints and martyrs. It is also the silenced, the erased, the forgotten. It is also children whose voices were stolen, whose names were buried, whose lives were consumed by power. And so we end not with John XII, whose sins are already infamous, but with the boy, nameless, voiceless, but unforgettable. He is the shadow that lingers in the Lateran, the silence that speaks louder than chronicles, the reminder that history's darkest truths are often hidden in whispers. Through whispers of history, we remember him.